Okay. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the AFL-CIO. My name is Kathy Feingold. I'm the International Director here at the AFL-CIO, and it is an honor to welcome you all to the House of Labor and also to Black Lives Matter Plaza. I always feel that our building and its location center us in some of the key challenges we face today, which is what we're going to discuss, creating an economy that works for all workers. And today's panel will look at the impact of the current set of crises and what we can do to address them. The cost of living crisis has hit workers hard. We know this. We see it here and around the world. It's eroding wages, causing hardship across the world. But workers did not cause this. Economic shocks like COVID, the Russian aggression in Ukraine, chronic underinvestment, and corporate concentration and price gouging all contributed to high rates of inflation. Even the IMF agrees that wage increases did not cause this. So workers around the world are protesting because they cannot meet their basic needs. Some of you may have participated in yesterday's protest. I saw some great photos online right here outside the World Bank, where members of one of the AFL-CIO affiliates, Unite Here, Local 23, picketed yesterday because their wages at the World Bank can't cover the cost of living. We'll hear about the protests that erupted all over the world, including ones here in the United States. Meanwhile, we have heard and seen this recipe for disaster before. Countries are cutting budgets, cutting wages, making the crisis worse. For those of us that actually were in this room and many other international fora during the 2008 crisis, we know all too well what happened when governments turned towards austerity. We know what happens, for example, when governments take away key programs, like what's happening here in the US that were created during COVID that put a floor under workers and are now being dismantled, like what we're seeing with our expansion of the Medicaid program. We'll hear about these austerity measures, and we'll talk about how governments and the IMF can respond to the crisis, because all too often the current response is repression. We'll hear from colleagues from the Tunisian UGTT who have been jailed for protesting austerity, while international trade union delegates have been barred from entering their country. So I'm excited about today's discussion because we need a better path forward to confront the cost of living crisis and enable shared prosperity. I want to thank the sponsors of today's events, AFL-CIO, ITUC, the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, Global Social Justice, and of course, the Frederick Ebert Stiftung. And I will now turn the program over to the panel. Thanks so much and welcome.
Thank you so much. The red button on the bottom.
So the light's on. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Kathy, for these wonderful opening remarks. Thanks to everyone who could join us in person. Thanks to everyone who is joining us remotely and virtually through our stream. Kathy, I think, just pointed rightly at the fact that we are living in a time of crisis. But when we are being honest, we are also living in a time where perception matters. And my impression is that sometimes perception seems to matter more than what we think are the facts. You know about tweets who can dictate entire news cycles. We all are familiar with iconic pictures who emerge out of nowhere and then at the end of the day dictate policies. So sometimes the impression is that, you know, perceptions matter more than facts. And when we apply this creeping suspicion to our topic today, the question is, are we really living in an age of crisis? Or is it something that we only feel is happening? In other words, does our diagnosis of an age of crisis tell us more about ourselves than about the world that we live in? Because certainly protests have been around. We don't have to go back to the storming of the Bastille. I mean, when I was young in my home country of Germany, people were taking into the streets to protest the use of nuclear power, the rise of right-wing extremism. And of course, being based in New York, I like to remember, you know, Occupy Wall Street more than a decade ago. So the question, I suppose, is what's new? And is this real, or, is this a storm in a teacup, or is it more a teacup in a storm with us being the teacup? So the purpose of this panel this morning is to find out, take a look at the facts, and try to understand what is happening with regards to protests around the world. And I'm very pleased that we have a group of eminent experts on these issues who will share their insights and thoughts on these matters with us. We'll kick this off by Naomi and Jeff presenting key findings from a study, which I'm proud to say FES supported throughout the last couple of years with what I think are stunning results. We're looking forward to that. After that, we'll have contributions from two excellent discussants, and then we'll open up the forum for question and answer. So get ready to ask smart questions or silly ones. I'm sure the panel will do their best to try to answer it. Without further ado, Naomi, over to you. We're looking forward to hearing key insights from the study that you've conducted. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for this provocative start. Is it real or is it fantasy? I suppose is a big question for us. How do I get onto our slides? That's the one. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you very much to everyone for being here. Thank you very much, AFL-CIO and the ITUC, to Alex Campbell for organizing us, Sarah, and your colleague Lena for making it all real. Very pleased to be here. I'm Naomi Hussain. I work at the Accountability Research Center at American University. We're based in the School of International Service. We do action-oriented research with movements and groups that are on the forefront, on the front lines, we like to say, of accountability struggles. And I work with Jeff Hallock, who's also a researcher at the Accountability Research Center, as well as a PhD student in the School of International Service. And we're going to summarize today very briefly work which Michael mentioned that was commissioned. We want to go back here, I think. Work that was commissioned by FES New York to find out really what was happening in November in 2022 with respect to cost of living protests. We're going to talk about the motivations of the research, a little bit about the methods and what we found in terms of where and how many protests there were, what protesters were complaining about and who they were. And very briefly, we will summarize some of these implications, especially for international development agencies, given the week that we are and that we are in Washington, D.C. for the spring meetings. I think some of those implications are relevant. The background to this piece of work is that after the pandemic and when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was an expectation that food and fuel prices were going to shoot up. And as you can see, these are the global food price index and global fuel price index from the last 5 years or so, indexed at 2016 or 2017. And you can see how high, in fact, energy prices did rise. Within the red circle is the period within which we did our study. So you can see at its peak, energy prices, the global energy price anyway, was almost 3.5 times what it had been 5 years ago. So it's not surprising that people were a bit pissed off, let's say. When we talk about protests, we talk about food riots or fuel riots, we tend to talk about these as if they're indicators of the health of the global economy. And I think people in the IMF perhaps do perceive them in this way. But as far as we're concerned, I think we also think of these as indicators of failures of accountability on a global scale. These are very much political issues and not just economic issues. Michael started off referencing the French Revolution. That's just one of many, many major uprisings and smaller uprisings which have been triggered by food and energy protests. So these are the reasons why we thought these were important issues to look at. Oops, what happened to this? So a little bit, I won't bore you with the details of our methods, but we drew on the Armed Conflict and Location Event data set, which is an excellent data set, which provides in very summary form, high quality data, triangulated data about protests from which you can identify more or less what they were about, where they were, and what happened. This gives you a bit of a sense of how we went about this. We didn't include, and I think this is relevant for this audience, we did not include industrial disputes, collective bargaining, except where the protesters were public servants, and we're explicitly referencing inflation rather than just bargaining with employers over pay. We left out a lot of other protests as well, like the farmer protests about agricultural inputs. And we left out a lot of protests where they stopped being about food and energy, bread and butter issues, and started being very much more explicitly about bad politics, bad governance. So for instance, many of the protests that happened in Sri Lanka shortly before the government fell there will have been excluded from our data set. So what I'm telling you is that what we found here is actually quite a conservative estimate of the extent of these protests. And I'm going to hand over to Jeff to give you a bit of detail about what we found, how many, and so on.
Thank you, Naomi. So this graph that you see here is a little bit similar to the one we saw 2 slides before, but we're just overlaying the fuel price index and the food price index with the protest that we coded over the course of November 2021 to October 2022. During this time, you can see that spikes in fuel prices also coincided a bit with more people getting out into the streets. We're not trying to make a causal claim that the fuel price increases led to people going out into the streets, but we did see a common occurrence of energy costs being a main driver of the grievances that people were expressing in the ACLA data set. So to talk about the scale, what we actually saw, and as Naomi mentioned, we see this as a bit of a conservative estimate. We coded over 12,500 unique events in over 148 countries in this 1-year period. The peak, as we saw on the last slide, was after the Russia's invasion of Ukraine in about mid-summer. But as we saw on the last slide as well, these protests were pretty strong throughout the year. One benefit of the ACLA data set that we use is that we were able to capture a lot of these small and localized protests. So we feel pretty confident that we were capturing the real grievances that people had in the lack of accountability they felt their governments were facing. But it's also important to note that many of these individual protest events spiraled into countrywide episodes. As you can see in the picture here on the right, Ecuador represents a great example of how one group leading a movement ended up turning into countrywide protests, eventually triggering 1,000 protests in the course of a month in June 2022 in Ecuador. 30 different countries saw over 100+ events during the period we looked at, again, indicating the widespread nature of this protest wave. And as noted on the previous slide, a lot of these were about energy. So we did the best job we could, really getting into fine-grained coding, differentiating energy in food protests. But one common thing we saw was that broader cost of living protests were often wrapping in other types of grievances, whether it was about rent or maybe a lack of accountability in the government. But energy was often a factor, even included in that broader scope that we were looking at. And one important point that we're happy to expand upon later is that we feel fairly confident what the data is telling us is that this protest wave was more widespread than in 2008 or during the 2010-2011 waves. And I think we have some people on the panel and Naomi who can expand on that later if you have any further questions. So we think this map does a pretty good job of showing the true widespread nature of this protest wave. The darker coding shows where the protests were more vigorous, where we coded more protest events. And the 3 regions that really stood out when looking at the data are Latin America, South Asia, and Europe, which is quite important because we're looking at different levels of economic development across these countries, sometimes different political regime types, but the intensity of the protest wave is consistent across the globe. In Latin America, we see places like Haiti where political instability, lack of access to food, lack of access to fuel drove people out to the streets. Proposed fuel subsidy cuts in Ecuador, leading indigenous groups to spearhead a movement to challenge the government for creating hardship on top of hardship that they already had during the summer. In South Asia, we see with Pakistan, IMF conditionality coming into play, people coming out into the streets and contesting what they saw, in their words, as foreign imposed policies on domestic constituencies. And across Europe, we saw protests from both the left and the right. We saw labor unions coming out into the streets. And so, again, just to underscore that we see this really as a global protest wave. To give a little background on the protesters, it really was a diverse and broad coalition of people that went out into the streets, both within countries and across countries. We saw evidence of left-wing parties and labor movements coming out to the streets, which I'll expand a little bit on the next slide. But we also saw sometimes opportunistic opposition parties, right-wing parties coming out to the streets. But we also saw unaffiliated movements. And this is a really important one that we saw in Sri Lanka. At the beginning of the Sri Lankan crisis, we saw youth, students, diverse coalition of people coming out into the Gulf-Face Green in Colombo to protest failed government policies and rise in prices on myriad goods, lack of access to prescription medicines. And these coalitions brought more people out to the streets. Sometimes these coalitions created welcoming spaces in which collective action was enabled and made possible. The ACLA dataset also allows us to have some fine-grained information on who was involved in the protest movements. We saw labor as instrumental in over 4,000 of the protest events. In more than 1,000 events, we saw fishers, farmers, peasants. We also saw large evidence of taxi drivers, construction workers, truck drivers coming out to protest rising fuel prices. In over 200 events, we saw women-led movements. So for instance, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and Mauritania. So before I turn it back over to Naomi, we just wanted to flag one specific case that was quite interesting. And in our report, we flag in a little bit more detail, especially as the building we are in, we thought it was important to flag Panama, where this was one of the most consequential protest movements in 2020 with over 300 events, mostly concentrated in the summer of 2020. And it was largely spearheaded by labor unions. So the protests initially started with teachers unions decrying cost of living increases, organizing to take out to the streets. And as the protest movement evolved, other labor unions such as Suntrax, one of the biggest unions in Panama, came out to support the teachers unions. This collective action in the street created a safer space in which just average citizens could come out and protest. And it really became a nationwide movement that made international headlines. We've coded the different protests in Panama during this period. And you can see that they're not just concentrated in Panama City. This was really a nationwide event contesting what was seen as corruption, indifference, and lack of accountability from the government. The protesters ultimately were able to get fuel price freezes, driving down fuel prices that were up over $5 a gallon, down to just below $4 and eventually close to $3.15. And they were also able to win concessions on freezing prices on other essential goods. Whether or not this protest that we saw in Panama in 2020 is going to have a disruptive effect on Panamanian politics writ large still remains to be seen. But a lot of sharp analysts are saying that the protest wave that we saw in 2020 is likely to have profound effects on the upcoming general elections in Panama in 2024. So just to say that not only are we seeing these protest movements, people going out into the streets, but the tail end of how they can affect politics domestically could be incredibly consequential in the future. So on that, I will turn it over to Naomi.
Thanks, Jeff. It's a really useful example, I think, of how these events play out, you know, into broader politics. They're not just about the cost of living. They end up being about something much more profound for people and for political systems. I wanted to talk a little bit about the specifics of the grievances, what people really were protesting about. And I think, you know, we've made this point. I think it's really important to reinforce this. These were very much about energy. These protests were very much about energy and energy poverty. Later in the year, cost of living and inflation were the language people were using. I think that, you know, the ways in which energy price rises fed into other basic costs of living really began to be felt by people around the world. And I think it's important to note that if we compare this with the 2007, 2008 wave of food riots, I don't even know if people remember this stuff now. Anyway, there was a huge global food crisis in 2008, and there was a massive wave of food riots around the world, mostly in the global south, mostly in Africa, I think in sub-Saharan Africa at that time, but elsewhere. And this was followed in 2010, 2011 by the Arab uprisings, which many people believe were triggered by food and energy price rises as well. in any case, what I really want to say is that this is very much an energy price crisis. The really big implication of this is that it's going to be very hard, we think, for countries to, for the world to transition to renewable forms of justice, given that people are coming out not against fossil fuels, but for their right to be able to live with an affordable cost of energy. I should also say it's very important to recognize that people don't just protest because they can't afford things. This is not just, people look at their bank account and think, oh, damn it, I'm going down to the streets. They protest because their governments fail to protect them from these crises. We know this from the very short information, the very short description of the events that ACLED put in their data set, but also when we've gone into any more depth, we have country case studies in the report for FES as well. This is what we hear over and over again. This quotation from these Albanian protesters, I think, really summarizes it. These protesters said, among other things, we know about Ukraine. We know, that we all have to make sacrifices and so on and so forth. But we are suffering because wealthy elites are colluding and the government is refusing to help us. A really important thing to note is that often people take to the streets when governments cut their subsidies, food or fuel subsidies. And this is a big issue, and it's often driven by IMF programs that are in place or are coming down the line. People protest because they believe political elites are in collusion with economic elites. I think, Kathy, you mentioned price gouging is certainly something that comes up a lot. Fears, perceptions of, to refer to Michael's point, perceptions of speculation, hoarding, and price gouging have been very important. And overall, we think this indicates overall a failure of global accountability, not only of the global economy. I like this quote from these protesters in Jakarta because it points out that if this is about governments not listening and not responding as much as it is about high prices. So just quickly, a couple of the implications of these protests, I think, in particular, thinking about what this means for the international development community. One is that, if you have to take the streets to defend your basic economic rights, your basic ability to get your kids to school or feed them, this is a serious problem at a time when governments are increasingly willing to attack protesters or criminalize protest. And this is true all around the world. I think we think of cost of living protests as the point at which civil and political rights meet economic and social rights. And we think that human rights defenders should, at times of economic crisis, specifically track these protests, what happens to them, and how governments respond to them. We see also that there has been a rise in right-wing parties, in particular, quite far-right parties, capitalizing on this kind of popular discontent. There's also been some more, I would say, softer left electoral victories which have capitalized on these. But on the whole, it seems that the governments that are in the center find it quite hard to respond. They neither want to control prices nor do they want to give handouts to people who are suffering. Thirdly, we think it's very clear that transitions to renewable energy sources will be neither just nor smooth unless people have a say in energy policies, a proper say, a real say, a meaningful say. And finally, protests often kick off when governments adopt reforms proposed as part of multilateral lending programs. It seems to us, therefore, that the IMF, among other organizations, has a responsibility to do their political risk analysis and to act in ways that protect citizens from what are predictable protests. They know these are going to happen. Very last point here. I just want to reinforce this point. This last year, we saw a wave of protests that almost certainly in 1 year dwarfs what we saw in the very, very turbulent period after the last global food, fuel, and financial crisis. Notable that civil unrest is now more important for insurers than terrorism in insurance claims. Civil unrest has become very, very significant all around the world. All of these protests indicate, among other things, a combination of crises of care, of climate, finance, and politics. And this is why we say these mark a failure of accountability on a global scale and not just a glitch in the global economy. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi, and thank you, Jeff, for this really concise summary of very noteworthy developments. I wanted to follow up with one question before we move on to listen to a trade union perspective. what struck me as most surprising, I think, is the map of protests that you shared with us, where you basically could see that protests have moved north to some extent, where really focal points of protests where people took to the streets were in Central Europe, for instance, or my home country. So when you discussed political allegiances of protest movements, and you mentioned far-right protests, but also left-wing inspired protests, I was wondering if there's a class element to these protests, and I was wondering if you could perhaps comment on that. I don't know if Naomi, you want to do that, or Jeff can do that. Is there a class element to this protest as well, or is this really something that cuts through social classes?
We can.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. It's an excellent question, and certainly, of course, I wouldn't be a researcher if I didn't say we need to research it more. But I think there is a strong cross-class element. You see it when you look at the composition of the protest groups. There's a lot of different, quite unlikely alliances in some cases, and sometimes not even alliances. Everyone just coming out at the same time. I'd say we did see quite a lot of public sector workers as well, teachers, health workers, and so on. A set of struggles which obviously predates the current cost of living crisis, the squeeze on public sector pay in many countries has meant that that's been a real factor. But I think really, yeah, I would say it looked to me cross-class more than a single class alliance.
And if I can say just one anecdote that I found very interesting from the research was how climate change could impact with what are traditionally considered blue-collar jobs. So in northern Colombia, there was a story of a protesting fisherman who said that we have to spend more money on fuel to go further out to fish because climate change has made our fisheries closer to the shores unfishable. They can't provide a living there. So there's this kind of cycle that exists where the people who ostensibly do not want to be having to go further out to invest more resources to make a living are the victims of climate change, but also ones that are more or less perceived as perpetuating it by using fuel to then go further out, right? So there's kind of this vicious cycle for certain groups of people who are the victims of this issue, but then also have to pay the higher costs through both the fuel they use and the time they have to expend for going further out. So I just thought that was quite an interesting anecdote on, who's affected by these issues.
Thank you once again, and also for answering my question. Let's move on to the trade union side of things. And both of you mentioned that the data shows that there were, if I recall it correctly, about 4,000 protest events that were staged by organized labor. I mean, in many ways, I suppose this is unsurprising. I think it's fair to say that trade unions in many ways are sort of a matured form, an institutional form of protest. This is where it started. So it's unsurprising that they would play a role in that. But I was looking forward to hearing a more informed perspective, perhaps, on what is happening on the trade union frontier, and also perhaps to illuminate programmatic positions on how to deal with these issues. And I'm very pleased to welcome Will Spriggs to the panel, who's a professor and former chair of the Department of Economics at Howard University, and also chief economist of the AFL-CIO. So Will, I think we have about 10 minutes for you, and please, the floor is yours. I think we will better share this microphone.
No.
I hope.
The lights on. Well, I would want a little better context here for fear that this becomes the fodder for the IMF, the World Bank, and my friend Larry Summers. Because Larry Summers' admonition is inflation is horrible, it kills the working class, it's the enemy of the people, and look, people will demonstrate and overthrow a government over inflation, but they're not going to do it if you destroy their jobs. And he would say, well, look, see, people demonstrated more because of this than they did in 2008 when we destroyed the labor market. So I would want this with a lot more context, and a lot more nuance. So there are a couple of things to unpack here. One is a global fetish with markets, and the belief that even should we totally disrupt markets, that we will still rely on markets to solve the problem, which they can in the very long run, but they obviously cannot in the short run because they simply cannot make adjustments to massive disruption. So in 2020, the massive disruption of COVID, and then we have a massive disruption when Russia unjustly invaded Ukraine, that war of aggression. We have not had a war of that dimension in terms of global economic importance since World War II. In World War II, we suspended the belief in markets, and we understood, and everybody engaged in some form of rationing in order to respond to what we understood market disruptions would lead to unprecedented movements of prices that we didn't want to tolerate. And we wanted to consolidate resources. This problem with Russia is an inability of leaders to come together to meet the challenge of that disruption. So have governments failed us? Yes, because of course, Russia as a major producer of energy, a major producer of fertilizer, a major producer of wheat, Ukraine being the second most important to them in wheat, and the United States being the remainder for wheat. These were going to be unbelievable, unprecedented shocks. And rather than global leaders saying, you can't let the markets solve this, we have to come together collectively as a world to figure out how we're going to confront that. This is where global leadership failed. Leaving this as a cost of living crisis, and this is my concern in the way in which I fear this was presented, gives the sense that the IMF, the World Bank, and the Federal Reserve are correct, that they're the heroes in this situation because they're the government agencies who are clamping down to fight inflation. And I don't agree with that, because this is not the result of global demand forces. This is the result of shocks in supply. And characterizing it carefully is exceedingly important. One, because as I said, knowing that this was going to happen, global leaders needed to drop this fetish with markets and say, how do we come together? Knowing that there wasn't going to be enough food in the world, how do we come together and say, what are we going to do about this? Because we know there are countries that are going to be more stressed because there's not enough food. You can't have, of the three largest producers of wheat, the United States, Russia, and Ukraine are the largest producers of wheat. Everybody else, no offense to your country, isn't also ran. You're not in the picture. You can't take the two of the top three out and then say, oh, food prices aren't going to be affected. Yes, food prices are going to be affected. And you can't have global warming and droughts destroying rice, because that's what the other half of the world eats, a wheat world and a rice world. You can't have that happen and then say, let the markets figure this out. So going forward, we need to have this recognition that using markets to allocate in the face of scarcity is not the way you want to do it. And if you wanted to defang Russia, then you don't defang Russia by simply saying we're going to boycott your energy. You have to have a broader solution about now that we've agreed that we don't want Russia in the energy market, what is our response? Is it going to let the markets be the markets? There's fewer fuel, it will get bid up. So that's for me, that's the key here. Otherwise, you get the IMF, the World Bank, and our Federal Reserve as the heroes. They are not the heroes. We have, from a trade union perspective, this shock to the system. Food and fuel on their own have prices that are higher, but food and fuel are inputs into almost everything else. So the shock that global prices, generally speaking, are going up, it's sort of a duh moment, because of course the prices of everything are going to go up, because it's pretty hard to come up with something that's not petroleum-based or plant-based. It's kind of hard to figure out what that would be. And then among manufactured goods, we know we had this huge chip shortage, which was unprecedented to have a long, massive shortage, a shock to the supply of producing something that was manufactured. We have not had that before. And we suffered huge price shocks from that. So excusing the interpretation by the IMF, the World Bank, and the Fed that these were demand driven and we have to stamp down demand is not a helpful construct. For labor, what happens when you get these unprecedented shocks or you get a supply shock, then it becomes a class issue. Because I'm a manufacturer, somebody suddenly raised my cost and I want profits. So who's going to take it on the chin because the relative price of one of my inputs went up? I can take it out on consumers and jack up prices. I can take it out on workers and cut their wages. Now, in the past, the solution was I take it out on workers. And what the Fed, the IMF, and the World Bank are doing is entering into that class analysis and saying, we're on the side of the capitalist, we're going to make workers suffer. We're going to ensure the conditions are such that employers can take it out on workers and suppress their wages. And then we get to be the good guy because, hey, we're fighting inflation and workers really don't like inflation. And you get the ridiculous things that you see constantly in the press here, the crocodile tears from our Federal Reserve. Oh, but this is for the good of the workers. You know, if their wages rose more slowly, if they lost some jobs and didn't put pressure on employers for higher wages, then the inflation would go away. And so this is planned suffering, or as Larry Summers says, it's the side effect of the medicine. You know, you take a cancer drug, it has horrible side effects, but this is what you do. And so I would be very cautious about the context, about how we think of these. This is very important going forward because we know the problem that we're having with food production is going to continue. It's going to escalate because global warming continues to shock our system. We have yet to see the full implications in the United States of all that rain that kept falling in California, because that's our fruit and vegetable basket. And we've clearly disrupted planting. The bad weather in the Midwest, if it delays putting corn in, has real implications because, as we know, these are warmer years, a couple of degrees, close to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and you don't get corn. If you plant it the way that we plant it, then it's okay because the corn matures before the heat. But if you plant the corn late, it matures into the heat, which is the problem that Europe had this year when its corn crop was decimated, because unfortunately the heat came when the corn was supposed to mature. So we're going to have these going forward. We're going to continue to have a drought problem in China. That's very important for rice production. And so we're going to continue to have these shocks. We have to have a better way of handling going forward these shocks that are going to make food a big challenge for human beings. And it's now. So this whole thing about global warming, worry about it in 2030 or 2040. No, it's now. It's now. It's not next year. It's now. And thinking through that is important. The lesson on energy is very critical. The faster the North goes to electric cars, the weirder the transformation is going to be for fossil fuels. We cannot imagine that these oil companies, when the United States is all driving electric cars, are going to say, yeah, we're going to stay in oil. This is a great business to be in. Their rapid pullout, and there's the potential for when do they rapidly pull out, it's going to create huge fluctuations for energy prices that other countries that are slower to adapt are going to have to confront. And we have to think through, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with that? This is a part of a just transition that we haven't fully appreciated or thought through because of this huge inequality that's about to take place. Because understand, in the United States, we've legislated that we're coming to that point, and we're investing to come to that point faster, that all of those cars will be electric and there won't be a gas pump to be found. And don't think that Shell and the rest of them are going to say, oh yeah, we're going to keep pumping out oil, even though no one's buying, even though no one's filling up a tank. That has real implications we have to think through. So I would hope we would take this as sort of cautionary about the fetish with the market, that governments need to think this through, that we give warnings that if you characterize this as being demand driven, you cut off the possibility for governments to respond, because the IMF is going to say, well, you're giving fuel subsidies. The problem is there's too much demand. Don't feed the demand. The World Bank is going to say it's a demand problem. Don't feed the demand problem by giving subsidies, and don't go into debt, because that's fiscal stimulus in the face of, it's the wrong thing to do if you have inflation. So we have to be very careful not to give credibility to the interpretation that the World Bank, the Federal Reserve, and the IMF currently have of this situation.
Well, thank you so much for providing some very helpful context, I think, and some critical context as well. That is, I think, further worthy of further discussion. We have the last speaker on our panel now, and I would like to bring into the discussion Abderrahman El-Laqqa, professor from the University of Tunis, who has graciously accepted to speak in English, and we are very grateful to that. So thank you so much. We have about 10 minutes. Please feel free to use the podium, and then the audience can already get ready to ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank organizer and Alex for giving me this opportunity to attend this event. I congratulate Professor Naomi, and Professor William for their presentation that shed light on a burning issue whose consequence impact directly the well-being of the large population. The report shows the global nature of the protest around the world, but my thought goes to those who are repressed by the post-tech regime and whose voice are not included necessarily in these statistics. The protests came to denounce the disastrous situation of the world economy after the COVID and the war in Ukraine, but also to show as, yeah. Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. But also to show the failure of several governments to put in place a decent social protection system, including in particular universal basic income that protect the most vulnerable groups of the population. And this protest also reflect a certain dissatisfaction with the public policy aimed to ensure access and equitable access to quality education and health, and the failure of government to fight corruption and to establish the fair fair tax system. As you know, the lack of the adequate social protection system increased the gap within and cross-country in terms of education and health capital in parallel with rising monetary inequality. And we discussed little the increases of monetary inequality. The question why intensity of a protest is rising, especially in 2022. This is basically related to general perception of government, of the general perception of people that government can do better. Basically, we can do better under the current constraint to protect the population regardless the exogenous shock. And we have to change our priority and our vision to protect the vulnerable population. On the question why general raise of in the cost of living must be tackled very, very quickly, beyond the impact of social cohesion and bipolarization and social fragmentation, the consequence of the episode, even short episode of poverty and malnutrition have a permanent impact on long-term well-being, especially among children. For example, how to restore the child health and put him back to the education system after leaving the school. For example, for Tunisia, many families reduced their health and education expenditure to cope with high food stuff. What I mean is that ensuring affordable access to basic needs would be less costly than future social policy that aim to correct the negative consequence of the current policy. On the question how to fight against the rising of cost of living, there is no one magic solution. And personally, I think on the multidimensional solution and multidimensional approach. The first one, at the national government level, we need to implement an effective universal social protection system. Many governments can create a fiscal space through fiscal reform and fighting corruption. And the example for in Tunisia, we have produced in the GTT several reports, and we see that we can create this fiscal space. This reform also could also restore the trust in the government and institution and the current institution and improve productivity. In Tunisia, for example, with the cumul of nearly 6 billion of recovered tax and custom debt, it is difficult to convince an ordinary citizen that the subsidy must be phased out. IMF recognized for Tunisia that the tax evasion and the VAT value-added tax is around $2 billion per year, and their recommendation is to reduce subsidy. We have to change our priority and our comprehension of how this economy, the functioning of our economy. Also, the second point is the necessity of inclusive social dialogue, which facilitate national consensus about how to protect the most vulnerable. At the level of multilateral institution, no one can dispute the importance of the long-term macroeconomic equilibrium and efficient allocation of public resources, but in the wake of the COVID, we need simply more time. This is my main message. We need more time for developing country to retrieve macroeconomic equilibrium. There is an alternative solution, but you must hear from civil society and the trade union. Also, we require at the global level, a deep and collective reflection about debt policy and how to find a sustainable path of debt for developing countries. Finally, to reduce the energy burden we will also need more solidarity at the global level, support for developing country to accelerate their energy transition and access to clean resource technology through technology transfer. And my last point, that finally, that success of any effort require transparency and accountability of the government. That can only be guaranteed by democratic regime. Thank you. I must stop here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Lachka. And you said that we need more time. And as a moderator, I can say, yes, that is very true. We do need more time. And unfortunately, we don't have any because we are, nearing in on the end of our session. But don't despair. I think we have time for one or two questions, which I would like to try to answer then in the panel. And then we also have a coffee break where we have time to talk. And of course, we have the second part of the program with a second panel and further room for discussion. So anything that cannot be discussed now, we'll have time for that later in the program. But please just show of hands if there's any comments at this point or any questions to our panelists. I think there was a lot of ground that was covered. Yes, sir. Please go ahead. Do we have a microphone? I think we'll need a microphone because otherwise our followers online won't be able to listen. Please.
Thank you. You mentioned IMF programs and oh, I'm sorry. My name is Michael Gallen. I'm with the Center for Economic and Policy Research. You mentioned that there might be a few cases where there were IMF programs involved in countries where there were cost of living protests. I'm just wondering if that's something that you looked at systematically at all, seeing the relationship between countries in which there might be IMF conditionality to cut subsidies and the like, any systematic relationship between these policies and the protests.
Let's see if there's any other question at this point. One more question, please, and then the gentleman in the back.
Hi, Judy Gearhart, American University Accountability Research Center. I want to pick up on the last set of comments about corruption issues, because listening to all of this, it does very much seem like this is a crisis of accountability and very much a class-oriented set of protests coming out, because a lot of the language you're quoting is about the government elites and things like that. That sort of resentment is popping up. And in this idea that we're not just letting the World Bank and the IMF say we need to tamp down inflation, there's a whole other set of responsibilities that we have put on the World Bank and the IMF that have to do with establishing effective grievance and remedy mechanisms whenever they do give a loan. And I think this is a part of the hope that we could counter some of the corruption that happens in governments and the way they're managing their economies. And I'm wondering if that's a piece of the work you see as needing more emphasis, and if you have any suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then one final question. Please, sir, come to the front, introduce yourself briefly, and then please be succinct in your question.
It's on Werner Graf from Harvard University. Two things. How would you categorize the protests or riots, one should say, which is happening in France right now? The other thing is, free markets. I don't know. I'm old enough to have experienced the 1970s oil crisis. So there was clearly a political impetus behind that to force the Western countries to have changed their policies towards Israel. And now again, we see that OPEC Plus is going to reduce production. So I have my own ideas why they would do that. But you see, there are agendas behind that, and I don't think it's only money. What's the question?
Thank you so much. These are excellent questions. They deserve more scrutiny and more attention than we can now give them. The keywords, I think, are corruption, IMF, and France. I think Bill, I would like to ask you to try to pick one of these. One of the questions was sort of inherently addressed to you. So please try to say something addressing the issue. And then I'm just using my prerogative as a moderator now, and I'll ask Naomi to have the last word.
So I would say in the case of France, this is part of the general distrust of government because the neoliberal agenda has been failing workers globally, even though France is a country that has maintained better than other countries their level of inequality, and they are nowhere on the path of the rest of us. The spirit of the French is stronger, I suppose, than the rest of us. So I don't think this is the cost of living as much as general disgruntlement globally with the neoliberal agenda. I would say for the IMF and the others, again, this problem has been exacerbated. The US monetary policy strengthens the dollar, which is exporting inflation to the rest of the world since oil is dollar denominated. And this gets back to not having sufficient global solidarity in addressing these kind of issues. In the case of OPEC in the 1970s, that was different. What the current thing in OPEC's thinking is, should Russia be returned to the global oil supply, they're going to get punished with massively lower oil prices and going forward. And they are trying to protect their interest. I don't think this is a repeat of them making a political statement.
Thank you. And last word, and then I'm afraid we have to have the end of the discussion while we have a cup of coffee, because otherwise our time schedule will be all messed up. So
Okay.
Naomi?
Very briefly on the IMF, Michael's question. We did somewhat systematically look at these things. The 30 countries that had the most protests, 100 or more, which really were big episodes of struggle. Of those 30, 13 had or were seeking IMF packages. So cause and effect is not very clear. What is very clear, though, is that there's very strong politics of fossil fuel subsidy reform. A very strong feeling against it in general, in the public, in the great public. And that is not because they want to destroy the environment or because they want cheap gas. It's because in many cases, these subsidies replace social protection. They serve the purpose of social protection, where governments cannot really be bothered or do not have the capacity to build a social protection system that will work. In response to Professor Lager's points.
Look, thank you everyone for the contributions. This was an excellent start of a discussion, not the end. We'll have a quick coffee break now. We started this off by, seeing that we are living in an age of protest. Let's see if we are also going to live in an age where political answers are being formulated. That's the topic of the next panel. I hope that I'll see you in a few short minutes. I'm refreshed and fortified by some beverages, and I hope some cookies. Thank you for coming, and let's continue the discussion in a few minutes. Thank you.
We start, please. Thanks a lot. Good morning. I'm Shireen Talat from the Arab Watch Regional Coalition, and I'm happy to join this very interesting, important, and timely discussion today with, of course, our speakers and with our colleagues here. It was very powerful discussion at the last session. And wow. So it was very powerful discussion at the last session. And why I'm saying it is timely, because actually this, what is happening around the global South, not only the global South, actually the global North, suffering from different microeconomical measures, different also, and I can say unfair measures like austerity and other policies is everywhere. But I'm coming from the MENA region. I'm Egyptian and I live in Morocco. And imagine how is that? Specifically, when we are speaking about social spending, which is, I can say, in certain country that you can microscopically see it. I was there in 2011 in Egypt, and I was proud to be there. And I'm expecting more in the region today because of what is happening. I'm not specifically speaking about a certain country in the region, but the whole region, the Mashriq Maghreb, as we call it, the whole region is in a deep, dire suffer because of debt, because of austerity, because of the usual active action on cutting on social spendings. So I hope through this discussion we can understand more and know more how governments can respond to the cost of living crisis. Because, and I will give you a small example. It was Ramadan in Morocco. I mean, like it's still Ramadan, I guess, but it was Ramadan, and our the kind lady that is assisting us in our home couldn't really afford to buy tomato because Moroccans depend on harira. It's a kind of soup which needs a lot of tomato actually paste, but she couldn't afford tomato paste. And what we were doing, we were cooking the harira at my place and we split it. Because this is how ugly the situation is. And I can say that Morocco is actually trying more to survive than any other countries in the region, but yet still people are in the street. I mean, yesterday they were in the street, tomorrow they will be in the street asking to have the minimum of decent life. So we have a very interesting panel today, and I will be happy to discuss this further with them. Let me introduce our colleagues here in the panel first. We will have Isabel Orteza, the Director of Global Justice Program Initiative for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University. And we are also going to have Mr. Rodrigo Cerda, Fiscal Affairs Department, Expenditure Policy Division from the International Policy Fund. And we're also going to have Mrs. Sherry Spiegel, UNDSA Interagency Task Force on Financing for Development, and Ms. Shara Razvi, Director of Social Protection. And also we are going to have our discussant, Mr. Karim Trabulsi from Tunisia. So let me just check that Isabel is online. Hello, Isabel. And
hello, good morning.
I want to also to say that Isabel is a close colleague. We worked together for 4 years or 3 years in establishing the End Austerity Global Campaign. Isabel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shireen, and good morning to everybody. I have a presentation which I'm going to try to set. Okay. Here, very good. Okay, my presentation has 2 parts. The first one is bad news, and but is followed by the last part, which is good news. And good news because this cost of living crisis and austerity can be, really ended today. There are a series of feasible and implementable policies that countries can take from today. So these are the good news, but let's start now by the rest. So this is this morning our colleagues were talking about food and fuel protest, and I wanted to show you another study that actually puts this type of protest in perspective. What you have, this is a study we did with the Frederick Ebert Foundation and my colleague Sarah Burke, and it covers thousands of protests in 101 countries, representing 90% of the world population between 2006, before the global financial crisis, and 2020, which was the end of study. And what I want you to see is the series. Now, people protest for many reasons. They protest because of you know, corruption, democracy, civil rights, but this is a set of policies that relate to cost of living, austerity cuts, and generally demanding for economic justice. So topics include from housing and pension reforms to reform of public services and of course, food and fuel prices. And what is important to see here is that since the year 2006, there's a steady and solid increase up to nearly today, and with a huge peak, which it happens after 2010-11, which is when governments are starting applying austerity cuts after the global financial crisis. Now, protesters are going to the streets because of demanding human rights, jobs, decent incomes and pensions, proper health and education, housing. So it's important to realize that. Now, the larger of all protests is actually about better wages, jobs, and labor conditions, followed by protest against reform of public services like health, education, water supply, and others. We have a number of other protests that you have described here. Now, all these grievances will require different policy solutions. The session now is about what can governments do, but all of them have something in common, and is that they're going to require more public financing or fiscal space. And this will be the end of the presentation, where there are good news. However, if we look at what governments are doing at the moment, is actually cutting public expenditure and entering into austerity cuts. What you have here in this map in red are countries cutting public expenditures. And as you can see, the whole world is red. The whole world really is on fire because of the current cuts. And this is impeding governments to finance the cost of living crisis, to achieve human rights and the sustainable development goals. And this is based on IMF fiscal projections contained in the wheel. Now, what you have here is the historical trend of that since 2008 to 2025 with projections. In dark blue, what you have is developing countries, and in lighter color, high income countries. And we did that because at the beginning of the financial crisis, people were saying that developing countries were not going to do austerity cuts, but they did more and more pronounced than higher income countries. So what you have, this reflects the number of countries cutting public expenditure. So as you can see, in 2008, 2009, and in 2020, the bars are very low. And it means that very few countries were cutting public expenditures. They were actually expanding, having fiscal expansion as they should, and that was a good move. However, this was followed by a premature and an intense amount of countries cutting public spending. And you can see it goes from 2010-11, and this was when, if you recall, protests increased significantly. And then now we get it after the pandemic from 2029 onwards. In red, what you have is the projections. Now, this year, 143 countries are expected to cut public expenditures. That means 85% of the world population will be living with a government that is implementing austerity cuts if things continue as they are planned. And cuts continue until 2025. So we can predict that social unrest is going to increase and protests were going to increase too. And how are countries doing these austerity cuts? So these are the main measures. For that, we read some 267 IMF country reports to understand the policy discussions that the IMF is having with governments and see what they were, agreeing or discussing. So targeting social protection appears as the main policy solution found, which is discussed by 120 countries. Again, in dark color is developing countries, and in lighter color, high-income countries. We'll talk about that later. The second austerity measure is cuts or caps to the public sector wage bill. That means the number and the salaries of civil servants, and of which the majority are teachers, health workers, civil servants at the local level that have very important social function to play. So cuts there have negative social impacts. Third most common austerity measure is eliminating subsidies, including fuel mostly, but also agriculture and food and others. Followed the next austerity measure, most common, is the privatization of public services, normally included as reform of state-owned enterprises, and that's a weird name, but it reflects from public transport, energy, water supply, and public services. Fifth most common measure, austerity measure, are pension reforms with a view towards, the fiscal view, meaning normally adjusting benefits to pensioners. And this is discussed in 74 countries. Then labor flexibilization, and followed by a very worrisome austerity measure, which is waiving social security contributions of employers, what is sometimes called tax wage. And that is actually extremely worrisome, as mentioned, because it threatens the sustainability of social security systems, meaning to try to favor enterprises in a time of low growth. They are allowing not to pay social security contributions, but this will be paid by future pensioners and by the middle classes and working classes, that they will not receive adequate benefits. And some countries are even getting cuts to health expenditure. And there are three measures that for revenue rising, mostly 86 countries talking about increasing consumption taxes of VAT, and which are regressive. And then PPPs, which we know we have significant contingent liabilities, and fees for public services. So all that has negative social impacts. And now I want to focus a bit on the targeting social protection, because what we see in many of these country reports is that IMF country reports is that they explain the problem, a big reform, and then they agree that they might have some unwanted social impact. And then they say, well, but now we are going to do a target social protection, a targeted safety net, and that's kind of the solution. Well, it's not the solution. And what you have here is a graph, the redistribution of world income by women and men by quintile. And on top, you have the richest 20%, and at the bottom, the poorest 20%, and in the middle, the other quintiles, 20% groups, which will be the middle class, working class. And by the way, the poor are below $2 a day, are 40% of the world population. So that's below the poverty line will be there. And this I know is a world income graph, but really it represents any country. And what you have on the top is that the richest 20%, they have more, they accrue more than 80% of world income. So this is extremely highly unequal world. Now, if you take a series of reforms, like it will be lower wages, or cuts on privatization of public services, or pension and social security reforms, or cuts to social assistance protection, or subsidies, or increasing VAT, these actually have, they take income from the middle classes that, by the way, are shrinking in most countries, and for the working classes, from these middle income groups, as well as from the poor, some of them from the poor, because they shrink their income. And then the solution that in these reports appear is to provide a safety net for a fraction of the poor, that it will be this little green thing below. And if you read our study, which is called End Austerity, you will see that actually there are large exclusion errors because it's extremely difficult to target the poorest. I mean, we're talking about 61% exclusion error from the poorest quintile. So a safety net for a fraction of the poor is not the solution to the loss of income for 80% of the world population. And again, this creates, we need to think, what is the world where, with this type of policies, what is the world we're creating? It's a world that accrues to the rich. And really, it keeps cutting income and services from 80% of the world population, including middle classes that are shrinking. Now, I would like to finish with the good news. And the good news is that there are alternatives. There's no need for all this suffering because there are financing and fiscal space options available even in the poorest countries. There are 9 options, 9 that are known to governments, and they're fully supported by the United Nations or by the international financial organizations. And they can start to be applied as soon as possible. So first one will be to increase progressive tax revenues. That means to avoid regressive taxes like VAT, and however, try taxes on corporate profits, taxes on financial activities. The financial sector is taxed very little or nothing in the majority of countries. Taxes on wealth, taxes on property, import exports, natural resources, digital service, or ending special economic zones and other tax exemptions and breaks to big corporations. And this is not a kind of wish list. This is happening now as we are speaking. For example, wealth taxes. They have been announced in Argentina, Iceland, and Spain, taxing windfall profits in the energy sector. This is happening in Algeria, Angola, Australia, Canada, Kazakhstan, Italy, Mauritania, Mozambique, Norway, Papua New Guinea, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the UK. Just saying the countries so you realize this is not a wish list. This is happening. This is implementable. Taxing digital services like digital online sales. We have that in Belgium, Canada, France, India, Indonesia, Kenya, New Zealand, Tunisia, Turkey. Financial transaction taxes have been applied in Argentina, Brazil, as well as new taxes to banks' windfall profits have been announced in Hungary and Spain. Mining and gas taxes have been operating for long in many countries. In Bolivia, they pay a universal pension for all other persons. In Mongolia, a little tax on copper exports allowed a universal child benefit for all Mongolian children in a country where the poor are low income are large. So this is a main avenue to find fiscal space and end austerity and cost of living crisis. Second option will be to fight illicit financial flows. These are illegal, like money laundering, bribery, tax evasion, trade mispricing. These are financial crimes that need to be fought. And the other options, financing options, are to restructure or to fully eliminate debt. And here we have 5 main options. One is debt relief cancellation. This is the main one wanted by civil society organizations. Then renegotiating debt, and more than 60 countries have done it in recent years. Debt swaps or conversions, over 50 countries, repudiating debt or defaulting. And by the way, more than 20 countries have defaulted or repudiated public debt, such as Ecuador, Iceland, and Iraq, and invested savings in social programs. What is fully needed is an international debt resolution mechanism and more debt cancellation. Fourth option, financing option, and that relates to social protection, is increasing social security contributions, the collections, by securing adequate employers' contributions, not cutting them, and by formalizing workers in the informal economy with decent contracts. And we have good example that in other countries, for instance, in Uruguay, and this is the case of the monotax, and I'm sure my Shara Rasabi will talk about that. Fifth will be to reallocate public spending, for instance, use defense, for instance, Costa Rica and Thailand use defense spending to finance health, though this tends to be more difficult. Six will be to tap into fiscal and foreign exchange reserves, like Chile or Norway did, adopting more accommodative macroeconomic frameworks, though this is more difficult given the levels today. Eighth option will be to lobby for more data and transfers. And ninth, and importantly, is a new round of SDR allocations. And for this to happen, we need a better mechanism that does not increase debt and does not increase conditionalities on countries, and a fair periodic distribution of SDRs. So all these options, they cannot be discussed behind closed doors. Now, expenditure and financing decisions affects the lives of millions of people, and they cannot be taken behind closed doors at the Ministry of Finance by a few technocrats. We need national social dialogue as part of good governance. We need to agree optimal policies through national social dialogue with representative free trade unions, federated employers associations, and relevant CEOs. This means not sharing information top-down, but joint decision-making. As we were saying before, current policies mostly benefit the wealthy with some minimal safety nets to the poor. We need policies that benefit everybody, all citizens, including the working and middle classes. And for the national dialogue, we will need a timely and rapid social assessment of the social impacts of the different policy and financing options and the alternatives. And thank you very much. And you have a number of reports there in case somebody's interested to download them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isabel. Yeah. Thank you, Isabel. It's always there's always a hope. There's always alternatives, but to understand also this alternatives and how that can be applied on the ground, we need to listen to countries, to local countries, countries by country, not only put a lot of measure or certain measures and distribute them around the countries, especially when it comes to fiscal space. When it comes to fiscal space, the situation in Jordan is different than the situation in Morocco, and it's different than the situation in Egypt. But apparently, that is not the case in terms of how IFIs, and unfortunately, this is how IFIs see the programs and the either projects or programs that to be applied in certain countries. They don't really think that every country has its own measures and its own situation. And that I want to hear first from Karim Traborsi from Tunisia, representing the OJTT, about Tunisia. And we were always in the region was saying, especially after the revolution, that Tunisia is the answer. But now Tunisia needs an answer. So please, Karim, go ahead. 5 minutes.
Thanks, Shireen. So as you said, I will present an overview about the situation in Tunisia, focusing on the role of the government. And I will also speak about situation in other countries in the Arab world. And please let me continue in Arabic, and we'll ask the interpreters to help me on that. تقريبا مثل المداخلة اللي قدمتها زميلتي اللي قبلي، أنه ارتفاع الأسعار الآن والاحتجاجات أصبحت حقيقة عالمية جلوبال، ولكنها تمس بصفة خاصة الدول العربية بما فيها تونس والمغرب، ما فيها أيضا مصر، وخاصة الدول التي تضررت أكثر بجائحة الصحية وخاصة بمخلفات الحرب على أوكرانيا.
First, I think I would say that, as my previous colleague has mentioned, that the crisis of the rise of cost of living is really a global one. And we see it very much in a number of Arab countries, namely Tunisia, Morocco, but also Egypt, that have suffered quite a bit from the pandemic and then from the effects of the Ukrainian war.
وطبيعي في فترة الأزمات أنه يكون دور الحكومات مهم جدا، وتدخل الحكومات يكون مهم جدا على الجانب الاقتصادي والاجتماعي. وهنا نحب نركز على زوج سياسات في علاقة بدور الحكومة: السياسة النقدية والسياسة المالية fiscal policy.
And of course, in times of crisis, where the government policies are really very important, especially in matters that are economic and social. Two areas of policy that I would like to stress on as government policies to address these matters are financial policies and tax policies.
monetary policy specifically.
Monetary
Yeah.
policy.
بالنسبة للسياسة النقدية monetary policy الأولى، يعني هنا الوضع يختلف من دولة إلى دولة. السياسة النقدية تفترض أن البنوك المركزية تتحكم في سعر نسبة الفائدة لتعمل نوع من الاربيتراج، من المعادلة بين نسبة تضخم من جهة وبين متطلبات الانعاش relance économique.
So with regards to monetary policies, usually it is the central bank of a given country that by regulating the interest rate, be the intermediary and try to solve the equation between inflation and and cost of living. Is that what?
relance économique.
And the stimulus, the economic stimulus.
وهنا الوضع يختلف من بلاد لبلاد. إجا ناخذوا مثلا المغرب نسبة تضخم كبيرة مثل تونس تقريبا اللي هي 10% الآن، لكن في نفس الوقت هناك نسب نمو عالية وتوصل ل 8 و 9% بطريقة أنه نسب النمو تغطي ارتفاع الأسعار.
Okay, so when we see how it is different from one country to another, for example, in Morocco and Tunisia, they have seen an inflation rate that is comparable around 10%, yet the growth rate is not comparable. So we have a growth rate in Morocco around 8 and 9%. That kind of lessens the burden of the inflation.
في الأردن الوضعية أخرى، يعني هناك نسبة نمو ضعيفة 1% 2%، ولكن في نفس الوقت هناك تضخم ضعيف أيضا تحت السيطرة. هذا يخلي السياسة النقدية عندها أكثر هامش من التحرك حتى يعني تدفع بالاقتصاد.
So in Jordan, the situation is quite different. We have also a very weak growth rate, around 1%, yet the inflation is under control. This stresses the importance of the monetary policy to address these matters.
المشكل هو في تونس لأنه نعيشه stagflation. في نفس الوقت عندنا نسبة يعني تضخم كبيرة جدا وركود اقتصادي، وهنا البنك المركزي التونسي اختار السياسة الأكثر حذر اللي هي الترفيع في نسبة الفائدة، وهذا دخل تونس يعني في حلقة مفرغة سيركل فيسيو متاع ركود تضخمي. لأنه
Okay, so in the situation of Tunisia, we have a stagflation in the sense that we have a high inflation rate and we also have a depression. The monetary policy of the central bank has been very cautious, which is to raise the interest rate that made us live in this vicious circle where we have this inflation and depression at the same time.
اليوم الاتحاد العام التونسي الشغل، المنظمة اللي أمثلها الآن مع أخويا عبد الرحمن الحاضر معنا، الآن بصدد إعداد مبادرة اقتصادية لاقتراحها على الشعب التونسي للخروج من الأزمة. ومن ضمن الاقتراحات ذات الطابع الاقتصادي أنه إعادة نظر في هذه السياسة النقدية البالغة في الحذر. فترة الأزمات تستدعي اتخاذ إجراءات استثنائية وإجراءات غير تقليدية، ومن ضمن الأشياء التي يدعو إليها الاتحاد في المبادرة أن تكون السياسة النقدية هذه أكثر شجاعة وأكثر يعني مجازفة، ولو على حساب الانفلاسيون في بعض الأحيان، لأنه ينبغي أن يسترجع الاقتصاد التونسي نسق النمو.
So with regards to the organization that I am representing here today with my brother, Mr. Abdurrahman, the UGTT, which is the main trade union, we are coming together with a new economic initiative that aims to address this crisis. And in that initiative, we stress that the monetary policy be less cautious and would be more courageous, even at the risk of more inflation, because we need the economy to step up its rate of growth.
نمشي للسياسة الفيسكال بوليسي. هنا كل الحكومات تقريبا في العالم العربي تعيش تحت يعني ضغط صندوق النقد الدولي، خاصة تونس ومصر، في علاقة بالسياسات التقشفية، وخاصة في علاقة برفع الدعم على المحروقات وعلى المواد الأساسية. وهنا احنا مش صدفة اللي احنا موجودين الآن في الاجتماعات الربيع لصندوق النقد الدولي والبنك العالمي. نحب نقولوا مساج يعني بطريقة مباشرة، راهو مسألة الدعم ليست فقط رقم في الميزانية، ليست فقط كلفة في الميزانية، ينبغي نظر لهذه المسألة من جانب اجتماعي ومن جانب يعني إنساني بالأساس.
So with regards to fiscal policy, we in Tunisia and in Egypt also, we are very much beholden to the IMF that wants to push austerity policies. They want to cut subsidies on fuel and essential staples. And it's not by chance that we are here during the spring meetings of the IMF, because we want to really carry this message that these policies cannot disregard the social and the human cost of these austerity measures.
طبيعي لما كيف تمارس ضغط على صندوق النقد الدولي كحكومة، لما لازمك تكون قوي في التفاوض، يكون عندك نوع من الندية في التفاوض. مع الأسف أن نرجع للملاحظة المهمة اللي ساقها عبد الرحمن في علاقة بالشفافية والتشاركية. اليوم لما الحكومات تتفاوض على برامج بطريقة غير شفافة، بطريقة غير تشاركية، لا يمكن لها أن تضغط على صندوق وتفرض يعني رؤيتها على الصندوق، تصبح في موقف ضعف.
Of course, how do you, one faces the pressures of IMF is really by negotiating skill and negotiations that requires that you negotiate as equals. And the issue, what we have is that we have a government that carries out negotiations that are not transparent, that do not consult anyone. And in that sense, it makes pressure from the IMF more likely.
واحنا المقترح في الاتحاد، واختم بذلك، احنا على يقين كمجتمع مدني وكنقابات انه لما تذهب الحكومة تتفاوض مع الجهات المانحة على أساس برنامج وطني حظي بتشاركية، حظي بمشاركة واسعة، فحتى الصندوق هو يتنازل على بعض الشروط، وهذا شفناه في تجارب مقارنة. مع الأسف الآن الوضع يعني مغاير هذا في تونس، وأول شرط يعني ومطلب في إطار مبادرة تلقى الاتحاد أنه يقع يعني حوار شامل حول برنامج الإصلاحات، ثم نذهب إلى الصندوق في مرحلة ثانية. وشكرا.
So, and with regards to the union, the UGTT, for us, we cannot face these donor organizations without having a national plan that's been subject to a wide consultation that gives you a strong hand in negotiation. But I think we'd like to stress the role of the unions, the role of civil societies, because once we have that very wide open dialogue, any reform could be more plausible, and with that could actually have some of the conditions of the IMF be negotiated down, as it was the case in some compared experiences. And thank you.
Thank you, Karim. Thank you, Kareem, for putting us in deep and to understand more about this also crisis, and also shedding lights on also different alternatives. And in that after listening to you and listening to Isabel and understanding that there is different option for financing fiscal space, and there is different alternatives also for austerity. I would like to hear from you, Rodrigo, on the IMF fiscal affairs proposals for the fiscal crisis. The floor is yours, 10 minutes.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. So it is not a very easy for us to explain everything. We have few minutes, but I would like to provide at least some vision of what we're trying to do concerning the cost of living crisis. Okay, and to do that, I think that I would like to split the problem in two. In one hand, I think I like one of the graph Isabel showed in terms of showing a picture starting in 2006 and coming to 2020. This is a long run trend picture if you want. And this is one picture. Another picture is what is happening today in terms of inflation, that, well, when we see inflation rate, of course, we're not used to those inflation rates we're having today in the world. And in some way, also we need to deal with that. So we have two different problems. Okay, and so I will try to touch on both. I hope I have the time. So on the first one, okay, so the long run trend. Yeah, what we have trying to do in the fund in many countries, and we were yesterday in another panel in which I also tried to show that we at the fund we have been involved in costing what are the SDG targets for the year 2030 for at least 20 countries. The costing means if we get to the sustainable development goals, what does it mean in terms of spending? And this is, of course, we at the fund, one of the things we do is to look to public finances. So this is one of the reasons we're trying to do that. And I showed yesterday that we have been doing those studies at least in 20 countries. And we are focusing, or we start with those 20 countries, because of course we think that those are the countries that need the most. I think that yesterday I showed that from some of those countries, just on education and health, we were talking about 8 points of GDP of larger expanding. Okay, which means that of course we need to have on the health side more personnel, more nurses, more doctors, and so on. This is not just the case on health. This is also the case on education. Okay, so when we look into that picture, what we're looking is that in low-income developing countries, we may require at least 15 or 17 points of increase in public spending to reach those goals. Okay, and we're trying to advocate in that sense. We're trying to do a good job in the sense that we're trying to go to countries to be as tailored as possible in those countries, to try to see what are the student to teacher ratios, doctors to population ratios, and so on, and see how much those need to be increased, how much is the additional cost in infrastructure, and so on. And so I think that in that sense, of course, there are some welfares and well-being targets that need to be addressed, and we are trying to make that point and to advocate in that sense. The second point, of course, is, well, okay, how do you finance? Okay, and of course, I mean, we're talking about 15 to 17 points of GDP in large spending, and in that sense, we also have been looking a lot to low-income developing economies. And in those economies, usually what we have been saying is that tax ratios are usually low compared to many other economies. And in that sense, we have some space to look for more taxation. And we have been talking about progressive taxation, okay? So in that sense, we do not disagree of many things that Isabel also said, okay? She was talking about a lot of different taxes. Well, of course, in each country, you should look at those effect of those. But so in that sense, the long run picture, we think that we're trying to, we're looking to increase social spending. And when I'm talking about social spending, I'm talking not just about social assistance, but also about spending on education and health. Okay, and this is key for in the medium and long run. Okay, so this is the first part of the picture, I would say. Okay, and in that sense, as you can see, we're also saying that we need fiscal space. Of course, this is a word that you are going to be listening a lot in the sense that we know that we have very large debt ratios, but we have those needs and we need to look for additional sources of financings, okay? This is one part of the picture, okay? The other part of the picture is what is happening today in terms of inflation. Okay, and in terms of inflation today, what we have is that we have a very large inflation compared to what we used to have, and we need to look for normalization in that inflation. Okay, and I hope I have the time to talk a little further because we just have a report from the Fiscal Affairs Department, the Fiscal Monitor. Usually have those reports on April and October. So I'm talking about the April 2023, the last report. And the report is looking to inflation and of course, what is the fiscal side can do, okay? And why? I mean, one of the reasons, if you look to the report where first we look to the impact of inflation on public finances, I may talk a little bit about that. But second, we also look to what are the distributional impacts of inflation, okay? Because inflation, at least in our analysis, does not impact equally to everyone in societies, okay? And I will try to talk a little bit about that. And finally, on the fiscal monitor, we're also talking about what can we do about inflation from the fiscal side. And we're worried about, because usually you have two instruments to fight inflation. One is the monetary policy, we were just talking about that. And the second one is probably fiscal consolidation, okay? And what we have been looking, or we have been worried about in the past months or so, is that when monetary policy is becoming too restrictive and you start to increase too much interest rate, well, you may also have some financial instability. And that might hurt a lot the economy and of course people. So in that sense, we think that also the fiscal side need at this moment to help not to increase so much interest rates or the monetary policy side, okay? So this is the way we're thinking. So if can I continue or? Okay, so, and on the distributional side of inflation. So there are many channels in our report, but one of the channels I think is most important, at least on low income developing economies, is that inflation is not the same for all the products and all the goods, all the services. And what we're seeing is that inflation has becoming much more relevant in food. Okay. And the problem is that in low-income developing economies, also food is much more consumed by the most vulnerable people. So this is one of the reasons we're saying that at this moment, we also need to try to look for more fiscal space. One hand could be through larger taxation. That might be one way to go, that's possible. But if not, we know that in some way we need to look for fiscal space. But what we're advocating is that we need to protect the most vulnerable people, because at this moment, most vulnerable people are clearly more hurt, at least in low-income developing economies. We also have been looking to our economies. In advanced economies, this is not what we're looking at. I mean, in advanced economies, we see that food also affect all the size of the income distribution. But when you go to low income developing economies, it's hurting too much the vulnerable people. So in that sense, what we're saying, okay, we need to look for fiscal consolidation now in the short run, but we need to protect much more the vulnerable people. And this is what we're trying to say. How do you do that? Well, I think it depends in each country. In each country, the situation is different. Probably in some countries, and as I was telling, in low-income developing economies, we're saying that taxation as fraction of GDP is much lower. And in that sense, you can look for more taxation. And not just increasing taxation. The other way is also to look for more revenue administration. This is another thing that we need to also to build capacity on. So in that sense, what we say is that at least in the short term, we need to look for fiscal consolidation, but we need to protect, of course, the more vulnerable people, and we need to look for the fiscal space on that. On our programs, if you looked on some of our programs, today we're talking about having in many programs some floors on revenue taxation, okay, and also some floors on social spending. Okay, so we're trying to build on that. Of course, everything could be improved, and this is one of the reasons we are also here, and we try to hear different experiences. But I think this is a difficult moment in that sense. I mean, if we don't address inflation, we may continue hurting the most vulnerable people, and this is one of the reasons we're also very worried about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo, for being that frank. And I know that the audience here, I can see a lot of questions in their eyes, especially when we are speaking about fiscal consolidations versus protecting the most vulnerable, which is a huge contradiction between both, to be honest. But we are going to come back to this when we hear from Shari about the recommendations of the UN Interagency Task Force on Financing for Development. And I believe that you have very important recommendations on that side. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I also know we're running out of time, so I'll try to be quick, which of course I won't be. So I want to say something about the report first. So this report it's led by UNDESA. I'm in the Financing for Sustainable Development Office of UNDESA, but we actually bring together the entire international system. The IMF is one of the main partners in this report, along with the bank, UNCTAD, UNDP. We have the Financial Stability Board, all of the norm setters, and the South Center. So it's really bringing the entire international community together and seeing where we can agree on recommendations for governments. So I want to start by the main messages are, of course, that the SDGs are way off track. That we defined last year, actually, that there was a great finance divide between the North and the South. And this year, we're talking about the risk of that becoming entrenched and really leading to a lost decade for development and a big development divide. So it's certainly a challenging time for financing for development in a period of global shocks. And financing is needed more than ever, but of course, it's more challenging. I was going to go through some of the data, but maybe there's not time. And we all know the impact on inflation, the impact on poverty, and the issues of food, the price of food, in particular food and oil and energy. And then, as already mentioned, the crisis is putting fiscal pressure on developing countries and governments whose budgets were already under stress. And that has led to the worsening of the debt crisis. Now, very interestingly, in the task force, not everyone, we actually had disagreements about what to call the debt crisis, because for some, it's not a systemic debt crisis in the sense that we don't expect there to be a debt crisis that will impact capital markets, et cetera. But nonetheless, so the way we try to shape this is that the debt crisis is that more than 60% of the least developed countries and 25% of middle and 60% are at high risk of debt distress or in debt distress, and 25% of middle income countries are under severe fiscal strain. And those countries are home to more than half of the poor. So the debt crisis is a crisis of people and the impact on people's lives. So then the question we get to, and I jumped through all of that very, very quickly, is the question about solutions. And as we all know, and has been discussed very much, there's enormous costs of whether we call it fiscal consolidation or austerity. But so far, the discussion has been on the cost to the most vulnerable and the cost of cutting social expenditures. And I just want to say, and I'll get to this in a second, that the report also talks about the problems that fiscal austerity also leads to a cutback in investment and public investment, and that has an impact on long-term growth. And so, and in fact, this year and last year, we've always talked about debt is not in itself bad. And when debt is used particularly to invest in productivity and in sustainability and resilience, it actually can lead to improved debt. You have higher debt today, but it leads to improved debt in the future, particularly if it's affordable. So that's one of the big questions, is why the cost of borrowing is so high for developing countries and how the international community can help with that. So one of the risks of debts of austerity or fiscal consolidation is that you also cut back on investment just at a time when investment is needed to achieve the SDGs. And you end up with a vicious cycle. So the solutions put forward, of course, there's no easy solution, and there's a really importance of how does one balance the short-term needs of the crisis with long-term, because we can't forget about the long-term right now, because we will just have crisis after crisis if we don't invest in the future. And so the theme of the report is actually the importance of a or a sustainable transition and using green industrial policies to achieve that. Or sustainable industrial policies, and that we can't delay investment in that's part of if we're going to be able to achieve the SDGs. Not only will it lead to future growth investment, but it also is where we transform energy and food systems, and also investment in resilience, which will reduce the cost of future crises. And I just want to say that just when we talk about solutions for inflation, one of the solutions, which of course is a little bit longer term, is to address the supply bottlenecks. And so some of them actually may be short term, we can deal with them, and others are longer term. And so if we cut back on investment today, that investment can help us address some of the supply bottlenecks for the future, particularly in poor countries, and with, for example, with food insecurity issues. So, so that's point one. The second point is where do we get the money to invest from? This is what we've all been talking about. The first issue that Isabel laid out, a whole host of different types of taxes. I'll say that one is additional tax to think about. It's not additional, but there is, and this is something I know the IMF wrote about several years back, and we include in our report several years ago, is corporate taxation. And particularly the distribution of tax between labor and corporations. And especially as we're in a world where capital returns have gotten so much higher and returns to labor so much lower, and yet, particularly with digitalization, and yet a big part of the tax burden is on labor and less on corporations. So how do we raise corporate taxes is one of the additional issues to think about. The issue, though, with many tax reforms, not all, is that some of them take time. And yet we have to deal with this crisis today. So that's why the next call is for this push of the international community to help the poorest countries in particular and help fiscally constrained countries. And that includes three different areas. One is the role of development banks, and that's why there's so much of a discussion on the role of development banks right now and particularly the World Bank and the Evolution Roadmap, where a lot of entities are calling to be even more ambitious. Because development banks, not only do they lend concessionally to the poorest countries, which is really important and that needs to be increased and thought about, and the role of grants versus loans, et cetera. But the second issue is that they do lend to middle income countries at way significantly below market interest rates. And so if you think about the debt crisis and the role that the high cost of borrowing plays in creating or perpetuating a debt crisis, the need for affordable long-term financing is really clear. And what some of the studies we've done showed that if the poorest countries that, if you look at developing countries from over the past, since the 1990s, or even before that, and if they had been able to borrow at US Treasury rates, what it would have looked like, and countries wouldn't have had to default, basically. So a big portion, or most of them, it's not every single country, but the majority, it would have been in a much, much better situation, even after accounting for debt reductions during restructurings. So this cost of borrowing and the need for long-term borrowing is a really important part of the story, and that's why we're talking about this MDB agenda. Another part, this is also goes, and the third part, which this all links to, is our changes to the international financial architecture, which is also under discussion. So one of the issues that we as a task force saw is that every chapter, I didn't say at the beginning that we follow up on the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which is a financing agreement to finance sustainable development across all countries in the world. And every single chapter, whether it's domestic resource mobilization, whether it's private finance and aligning that with climate and the SDGs, whether we're talking about debt, whether we're talking about development cooperation and the role of the MDBs, every type of the architecture is under question right now and being discussed. So there are debates going and discussions happening in the G20, in the Bridgetown Initiative, in this Marcon Summit coming up, in the UN, in the boards of the IMF and the World Bank about all of these issues. And so there's a real call that ultimately these shouldn't be done piecemeal. They affect everybody. This is why the Secretary General recently came out with the SDG stimulus, saying that these issues, which calls for that all of these issues, the role of the UN is really important because of this need because these reforms affect everybody, there's a need to have open discussions where everybody has a voice, and there's a need to bring them together in a coherent manner, so that we don't end up with incoherence where some of the reforms may hurt climate, or climate reforms may hurt the poorest and poverty. We need to think in a coherent way. And so that's the third area is this issue of development, of reforming the international architecture and how it's happening, and how we therefore need to think about how do we make it as supportive as possible for the agenda. So I had a couple of other issues, but maybe I will stop and let
Thank you, Shaibi. It's very important to know and to always still and keep repeating that we are in a multiple crisis situation that maybe that the world is facing for the first time, and that multiple crisis needs a response outside the box. I mean, when we are speaking about reforming the global structure, the holistic structure, we also need to think about fast and effective responses, and maybe and allow me to this, maybe issuing new SDRs can be a good response. I know it's a longer process, but it can be doable. And maybe also when it comes to the IMF, for example, because you're sitting beside me, eliminating surcharges can be an effective response for the crisis. But in that also, I want to hear from Shara. Shara, on the response and dealing with social protection as a response for the cost of living crisis. Shara, the floor of yours. 10 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Shireen, and it's been great listening to all the nice, very, very productive and rich presentations. So let me just thank the organizers, and to save time, quickly move to some of the points I wanted to make. Firstly, I think on this whole, cost of living crisis, which is being combined with a serious slowdown in economic dynamism, this is causing a really important and striking fall in real wages in many countries. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but global monthly wages fell in real terms by nearly 1% in the first half of 2022. This is the first time in the 21st century that real wage growth has been negative. And as we know, there has been a growing gap between productivity growth and wage growth. And this gap has continued to widen. And at the present time, we know that productivity growth is outstripping wage growth by about close to 13 percentage points. So this is really what's fueling also this longer standing grievances that Naomi was referring to in the first panel of today. These grievances that are very deep-seated, people feeling the economy is growing, but they're not, as working people, working families, they're not benefiting in the fruits of this economy. So it's not far-fetched to say that both income inequality and poverty in this kind of context, when wages are lagging behind, is going to rise if the purchasing power of the lowest paid is not somehow maintained. And here, I think ILO analysis suggests that there is very good scope in many countries for increasing wages, facilitated by good social dialogue, between employers' organizations, workers' organizations, trade unions, civil society organizations, without fear of generating a wage price inflationary spiral, because that's not where we are. The causes of inflation are not to do with wages growing. As in the first panel, was said, there are serious supply disruptions to do with climate change, to do with COVID, and so forth. So I think we have to put to bed this idea that wage demands and wages catching up is going to cause inflation. Now, in the absence of such adjustments, we know that access to food will continue to be compromised, particularly for low-income households, which spend, the bulk of their income on food. And World Bank evidence already shows that stunting and wasting in children and anemia in pregnant women are increasing in families that are really struggling to put sufficient nutrition in their diets. So we need responses now. And I appreciate Rodrigo's point about expanding fiscal space in the long term, but as the saying goes, we're all dead in the long term. Children who are stunting and not growing, this is also, if you think in economic terms, really undercutting your human capital, if that's how we need to think about these issues. Secondly, social protection, we know, is a very powerful tool to help households face, not just in context of shocks and crisis, but also their day-to-day life cycle risks. And there is, I think, since COVID, a much greater international consensus that social protection is important. It's an investment. We need to build it. However, in this context, let me just highlight 3 points that are of serious concern. Firstly, as we know, and I'm not going to take time to cite the data, the large majority, more than 50% of the global population, has absolutely no access to any form of social protection. Let alone, having adequate and comprehensive social protection, which is what international social security standards suggest that we should be building. Many workers, especially those who are at the lower end of the pay scale, are still not sufficiently protected. And ILO just came out with this World Employment and Social Outlook report, looking at what are called essential workers, care workers, workers in retail, in sanitation, and so forth. And the evidence suggests that 1/3 of workers on temporary contracts have access to pensions and sick leave. Coverage of self-employed workers is even lower. And, for a series of low and middle income countries, average coverage rates of employees was about 39%, but less than 10% for self-employed workers. This demonstrates, that our essential workers really need more than just applause. They need adequate labor and social protection. Secondly, even when we have social protection coverage, the adequacy of the benefits is an issue, because in many schemes, and again, we have data to show in more than half of the schemes for which we have data, there are no mechanisms to adjust the amount of benefit to inflation or to the growth in wages, which is what our international social security standards recommend. So basically, the amount of benefit that people have is melting in this context of, where their value and their adequacy is being eroded. So it is of utmost importance that countries without indexation rules, follow the adjustment principles that are enshrined in international social security standards and revise their social security systems, social protection systems, so that there are these automatic adjustments. Thirdly, on financing needs, I think our calculations show that on average, developing countries need to invest an additional 3.8% of GDP to be able to have a social protection floor. This is what is in the SDGs, and I'm glad that Rodrigo referred to the SDGs, because this is, something that we're all kind of trying to measure up against. Now, this means proactive means of ways of mobilizing resources. Now, Isabel and Shari already have given quite, I think, a very rich and comprehensive look at all the different mechanisms that exist. There are important discussions, as Shari just mentioned, whether it's on debt restructuring, on international tax norms, especially for taxing digitalized and globalized businesses and digital taxes, assets. And of course, there needs to be a serious discussion around debt restructuring. But let me leave it here. What I want to say, and it really complements what Shari and Isabel were already saying, is that we also need to give some serious focus to the role of social security contributions. For people who are covered, employers and workers contribute into social security funds. Now, we've had over the past few years, a number of international organizations and some academics suggesting that if we reduce social security contributions, we will create better conditions for employment growth and for formalization. Now, this is a very dangerous argument, and it's not based on evidence. And we've now commissioned a very important piece of research together with WeGo, which shows and really shows that the validity of these arguments and the empirical evidence for it is just not there. The evidence shows that social contributions are one of the main sources of financing for social protection systems, and that it has remained a stable source of financing in the 21st century. Furthermore, there is no evidence to show that when you reduce contributions, you increase employment and formalization. That's just not supported by evidence. So it's important that the policy recommendations that we give are based on the kind of evidence that exists. At the same time, any reduction in social security contributions creates an effective loss in revenues in the short term, which limits the fiscal space for social protection. And replacing contributions with taxes, which I'm afraid, I'm glad that Rodrigo is mentioning the importance of progressive taxes, but very often the emphasis IMF has given is on value-added taxes, consumption taxes, which are regressive. And this will create even greater inequalities. So it's important, therefore, that I think international financial institutions encourage the financing of social protection systems through a very judicious and appropriate mix of social contributions and taxes, depending, of course, on national circumstances. And if I may, let me just end by reminding us of the urgency of building universal social protection systems that include everyone, particularly in a context where we are facing serious and growing systemic crises that are really increasing, particularly in the context of climate change. Now, I think on this question of targeting, which again came up also in another discussion that Rodrigo and I were in yesterday, I think the evidence is very clear. Majority of studies show that levels of inequality are lower in countries with universal approaches. One explanation for this outcome is that more universalist systems, that social protection systems that include everyone, create greater incentives for people to pay taxes, and they feel they're part of the system. The general public feels that they're part of the system. So social protection budgets are larger in countries that have universal approaches. There's more incentive to pay taxes. Furthermore, I think there are huge risks with targeted schemes, particularly in countries where up to 60–70% of the population is hovering around the poverty line, below it, above it, but very quickly falls below it. And this idea that these targeting can be precise, even if you use digital technologies, I think is a bit of a wishful thinking. Very often the data is not there to really be able to target accurately, and using proxy means testing, we know, is not the way to go. It creates a lot of exclusions. It creates a lot of also lack of transparency. People don't know why some are included, their neighbors are excluded. So it really is not the way to go. Having said this, I think it's important to, it would be misleading to assume that there's no place for a means tested scheme within a broader universal system. This is what a lot of high income countries have. In practice, this requires that social protection systems have be legally anchored and public authorities take responsibility for their administration, including by ensuring that those who are eligible, they get the benefits and the resources are there to make sure that it happens, and that there are recourse mechanisms so that they can have mechanisms for redress and for complaints. Now, this is really a far cry from what we've been seeing in terms of these temporary safety nets that are neither safe nor rights-based, providing unpredictable benefits to a subset of the population, almost as if it's in a lottery, while they leave many other vulnerable groups with no coverage. So sorry if I took a little bit longer, and I'm happy to engage in the discussion if we have any time left.
Thank you. Thank you, Shara. That was very insightful. And unfortunately, we are running out of time. So I will open the floor for a couple of questions from the room, but please be quick and precise. So the floor is open for questions. Wow. Please.
Hi, thank you. Tommaso Faccio from the Independent Commission for the Reform International Corporate Taxation. I want to ask a question to the IMF representative. What's the political economy that prevents the IMF from including progressive taxation into their programs? I mean, I understand the rationale for including VAT consumption. It's easy to do, spread the base, but what are the pushback? Is the pushback kind of the elite or the people that you're dealing with? What is the, this kind of, well, I don't understand what are the difficulties? Yesterday there was an event on taxation, future taxation, and the finance minister on Niger spoke about, they want to tax capital less and tax consumption more, which is kind of goes contrary to progressive taxation. So I'd like to understand, what is the rationale and the political economy for that?
Thank you. Any other question? Okay, Rodrigo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I would say that, as a matter of fact, we try to push for progressive taxation, and I think we have a lot of different instruments to do that. Okay, so for example, we have some teams that are in the field and are trying first of all to try to have an idea about tax exemptions or tax expenditure. Okay, so this is not increasing taxation, but it's just some groups that are not taxed for some reasons, and we usually even don't know that. So we're building capacity on having to see which are those exceptions in different countries, and to, of course, try to use that also as a source of taxation. This is not increasing taxation as a tax rate, but is increasing the base of taxation. But this is just one of the things we're trying to do. We're also trying to increase taxation. Just I also show a working paper from, as a matter of fact, from people from the Fiscal Affairs Department, in which we're saying that at least countries should have at least 15% of GDP as revenues. And the reason is that if you don't have that, usually you don't have even the capacity to build institutions that help the growth of the economy and helps to reach people and social spending and so on. And when we're talking about 15% of GDP of taxation, well, if you go all around the globe, there's a lot of countries in where you don't have that. You are much lower than that. So in that sense, I mean, when we're talking about fiscal consolidation, we're also talking about looking for that space, and we're advocating for that space. And of course, that means that sometimes not sometimes, but usually what we're talking about is that about progressive taxation, in the sense that we know that the end what matter for people is the combination on tax and transfers. So what we want is that the people that are on the lower part of the income decile are receiving much more than what they're taking from taxes. Okay. 1 minute. So yeah, that's my point. And I think that we have a lot of reports on our website in which you can see that we're trying to advocate for this progressive taxation. Don't know if sometimes we do not communicate as much as we like, but this is one important source for financing, and this could be a finance for now, for the short term, but also for the medium term. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo. And I would like to hear final words from our panelists, from our colleagues here. And I want to start with Isabel. Please, Isabel, only 1 minute final conclusion.
Well, it has been very interesting discussion. I just wanted to do a comment on the difference between short-term and long-term. Shara pointed that out, and she was really right. We cannot do austerity and have difficult conditions today and say that people will benefit in the future. Reality is that many of these reforms implemented today are very difficult to reverse. For instance, if you privatize private services or you give contracts to a PPP to a company, it's very difficult to reverse that politically. Additionally, and as former director of UNICEF, if you fire teachers and nurses today, and if a child is stunting, it has enormous impacts on the future of that child when he becomes a person over a lifetime. So it cannot be that you do cuts today and say, these people will benefit in the future, because, the question that we need to ask is at what cost macroeconomic stability? And it cannot be that human cost, because we are amputating future, human development of a country, and policies anyway must be for all. At the moment, they are benefiting mostly the wealthy. So a balance needs to be found that is different, and does not put the short-term, long-term discussion. And for the rest, I really would like to congratulate all the speakers, because it has been a phenomenal session. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Karim, one final word. Sorry.
No, just thank you. It's been a really interesting discussion, and yeah.
Shara?
Oh, thank you. Yes, I have also really enjoyed listening to all the panelists. And maybe just to add one point, yes, we do undercut the prosperity of the future by making, all these, I would say, unnecessary austerity measures in the short term. But also to say we're also at a very difficult moment politically. I think with the kind of inequalities and polarization that we have, we're also at risk of really giving in to very extremist agendas, which I think we would all very much regret in terms of what the political implications are going to be. I think we need to bring societies together, reduce the inequalities, and reduce the polarization in order to have a bit more sanity in our politics as well. So I would really see us as in a very difficult moment where we can really go down the wrong path with the wrong kind of policies.
Thank you, Shara. Final word.
No, just thank you for the invitation. And thank you for the dialogue. I think it's important to have those. We're really trying to do the best of our job. It's a very difficult moment. So we're trying to of course, to make we know that the world is doing this macro adjustment. This is part of our work in the IMF, but we are trying to try to help the most people that we know that they're having difficult time at this moment. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. And it was a very interesting discussion. And actually, it can be a start for a real dialogue. I mean, a platform also for this dialogue can be very effective at this moment. And in this, also, I was to hand the mic to Alex for our closing remarks.
Thank you all. I'll be very brief. My name is Alex Campbell. I'm the Washington Office Director of the International Trade Union Confederation. And, I think as all of our speakers mentioned today, workers are confronting a cost of living crisis that they did not create. And, that's more or less broadly agreed upon up until this point, that it's not the wages are not driving much of this. Yet the answer everywhere from governments, from international organizations, is to cut in ways that harm the workers. And that doesn't work, and workers everywhere are forced to go out into the streets to fight against deteriorating living conditions, and all too often they're met with repression. And so along with the workers in the streets, we're here to try and propose new solutions, because we think the ones that we have now, as many of our panelists alluded to, lead not only to degradation of living standards and dignity, but to a lot of dangerous places in terms of politics and an inability of countries to grow and develop and foster equality and shared prosperity. So, they're fighting for investment and not austerity. They're fighting for justice and not repression. And I hope that the conversation that we had today takes us a few steps in the right direction towards a new perspective on this. So thank you so much to everyone. Thanks to the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. We have lunch here in the back. I will not postpone us further, but thanks so much to everyone for joining and speaking.